Okay, good morning, everyone, again, or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. We have the pleasure to have our final plenary speaker of this conference this year, and I'm very honored to introduce our speaker for us, since I already covered two of his papers in my cold class last year. So this morning we have Dr. Serge Bibauw, and please pardon my French mispronunciations in advance. Dr. Bibauw is a professor of French teaching at the University of Louvain in Louvain-la-Neuve, Belgium. And he studies conversational AI for language learning or dialogue-based call, more specifically or precisely task-oriented chatbots or dialogue systems for language learning at the intersection of task-based language teaching, computer-assisted language learning, and natural language processing. Dr. Bibauw's research focuses on in the instructional design and the evaluation of the effectiveness of conversational AI for L2 proficiency development, particularly L2 vocabulary size, spoken and written L2 fluency, and longitudinal assessment of L2 proficiency in various instructed SLA contexts. And all his publications are wonderful, but if you guys need to be informed or if you want to learn about dialogue-based systems, spoken dialogue systems, or AI-based conversational agents, you should definitely check out his work in the Routledge Handbook of Second Language Acquisition and Technology. He has a wonderful chapter titled Dialogue Systems for Language Learning, Chatbots and Beyond. And then he has a wonderful publication paper in Actual Language Learning and Technology titled Dialogue Systems for Language Learning and Meta-Analysis, a wonderful one for you to get started on the topic. And then finally, he has a 2019 publication in Computer-Assisted Language Learning titled Discussing with a Computer to Practice a Foreign Language, Research Synthesis and Conceptual Framework for Dialogue-Based Call in that journal. So he has great work in conversational AI, and he's looking at the history of it, and he's looking at the future of it. And indeed, he's going to share his thoughts about the future of this and the past of this conversational AI topics today with us. Thank you so much, Dr. Bibauw. Please join me to give a warm welcome to him.
Thank you so much for this very, very kind introduction, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's, as I said, really an honor to be here. I've really always appreciated a lot what's being shared at TSLL. I think it's really a conference that allows also to have a really new and innovative presentations about a lot of things that are still moving very, very fast. Things are sometimes moving too fast for my taste, but I really think it's a wonderful event which really allows to measure the field as it moves. So thank you so much for this invitation, and I'll try to introduce my talk today. I hope you can see my slides clearly. It's a new setting for me here, so I hope it will work. Okay, so new conversations, new evidence. I'm trying to give an updated view of the impact of bots, of chatbots, conversational agents on language learning in this new era where there's been a lot moving also, and I hope I will be able to show you how much things are changing extremely fast, but it's also very much a changing process in progress. And so I hope you will see with me that there are things where we only have some glimpses at what's going on, but hopefully it's really the opening of a new era for research as well. And I think it really is, as it's shown also in the extremely rich program of the conference here. So to very well clearly set up what kind of interactions I'm talking about today, it's pretty obvious, but here is a kind of conversation which I had earlier this week with Claude rather than ChatGPT. And also I wrote simply, I'd like to practice my Spanish by talking to you. Let's have a conversation. And it's interesting because I'm doing this for the past 2 years almost with different models, and it's not producing, it's producing better results every time. So here was its answer, immediately answering in Spanish. Hola, me encantaría ayudarte a practicar tu español. So basically, I would love to help you practice your Spanish. We can talk about what you want. What about starting with something simple? What did you do today? What are your plans for the weekend? And so, my plans for the weekend were giving a conference, right? So I said, doy una conferencia sobre chatbots. He said, and I'm shortening because, as usual, these models are a lot of, very verbose, right? There's a lot of things I'm cussing, but basically first feedback on, so interesting. And then what are you going to talk about? And also about emotions. Are you nervous or emotion moved or something by the conference? And very, very interesting. It showed this quick feedback here that you can see in italics. A small note, you said, I'm giving a conference, if I translate that, it's always tricky, which is good, but you could also say, I'm going to give a conference. Both are correct, but maybe etc. And this is super interesting because 1 year ago, it wasn't showing like that. So, okay, so some interesting talks, but so to be clear here, we're talking about interacting in a target language with a conversational agent, any kind of automated agent. And I'm going to expand this in a moment. To be clear as well, because we're talking about so much about generative AI in this conference and in research in general, here is my very simplistic view of affordances of Gen AI for language learning. First of all, let's distinguish affordances for learning, affordances for teaching, affordances for assessment. There might be even also affordances for research. But here, talking about, because a lot of presentations, I think, have been also about, for example, assessment. Here, we're really focusing on affordances for learning, right? On the learner side here and not on all the very relevant uses of Gen AI. Second, when we're focusing on the learner, I think we can very broadly and again, simplistically distinguish two broad uses of Gen AI. One where the AI is an assistant, typically a writing assistant before, during, after the writing process, but it could be about any kind of activity, but mostly about writing, or AI as an interlocutor. I would say these are the two major uses I've seen. And maybe AI as an assistant is probably more frequent even. I'm not sure what's your opinion on this. And I'm always actually interested in your feedback on this as well. Second, so here I'm actually going to focus much more on AI as an interlocutor, not really as an assistant. In AI as an interlocutor. Now, there's maybe a third use or a third role for AI, which is kind of encompassing or in between both as well, in a way, which would be AI as a tutor, like explaining, a content provider, explaining the language or explaining the grammar, things like that. Now, this is typically also, it can be mixed. Of course, there are overlaps between all these roles. And for example, we could say, if the tutoring is happening in L2, that would be also AI as an interlocutor, while if it's happening in L1, then AI is more really only a tutor, eventually an assistant, but certainly not an L2 interlocutor and not somewhere where you practice the language. Okay, so this was just to clarify where we are today, okay? Second, I wanted to say before I introduce the outline of my talk that this is really what I'm presenting here is really the results of a collaborative work with especially Wen, who's a PhD student here at UCLouvain and at 𝘊𝘰𝘯𝘷𝘪𝘥𝘦, who we supervise collectively with 𝘊𝘰𝘵𝘪𝘥𝘦 that you see here in the picture and 𝘊𝘰𝘰𝘪𝘥𝑦. And so it's really been a work where we've been discussing it. And so I'm going to show you also some of our thoughts that are really open to suggestions, to confirmation or to contradiction. So please, I'm really interested in your feedback on this. And so first of all, let's see a little bit what we are going to see today. So first, a very quick word about the fact that conversational AI is not something that started with ChatGPT. Then we're going to talk about what we know from this pre-LLM, pre-ChatGPT research. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what changed with LLMs, and I'm going to propose a new typology of this kind of conversational agents. And finally, I'm going to show you the preliminary results from a new meta-analysis that we are working on with 𝘊𝘰𝘯𝘷𝘪𝘥𝘦 about the effects of all these systems, including the very recent ones on speaking and L2 development in general. Okay, so first of all, as I always say, conversational AI is not new. It did not start with ChatGPT. The first chatbot is always very famously ELIZA in 1966 at MIT. Well, this was of course pretty limited but still pretty influential as well. And then we have also in language learning, especially already some reflections about using chatbots such as ELIZA for practicing a language or learning a language since the 1980s. Now, this has been done under many different terms and in many different fields. Typically, we've seen the word chatbots since the beginning with ELIZA, but as well as conversational agents, spoken dialogue systems, much more in speech technology, talking robots, really from robotics, voice assistants, intelligent assistants like Siri or Google Assistant, smart speakers like Alexa, and all these systems in the essence kind of have the same role, right? Here, providing an interlocutor to a learner that's practicing the target language conversationally. A very quick way to make sense of all these systems in the pre-ChatGPT, pre-LLM era would be to really distinguish two big types of systems. One, which is rule-based systems, which were mostly reactive. Those are typically called chatbots. They try to react to any user input, but they're mostly following handcrafted pattern matching rules, such as this one, which is still available on the web. And then another type of system would be dialogues, usually called dialogue systems, are more going toward, are working in terms of probabilistic intent recognition, and they are working toward goal-oriented tasks, typically trying to achieve tasks rather than trying to just have a small talk. And so you try to achieve a task by interacting with the system, and the system has a very different type of technology than these pattern matching rules, but it was still very, very much limited, right? And so here is an example from HALEF, which was a system developed by ETS in the 2000s, where, for example, the task here is to order a coffee at a coffee shop, right? Relatively simple, very different type of task, but and very different types of technology, but still, okay, two big major types of systems. Actually, because we are a bit far apart, and I'm not sure what is your experience with all this, if you want, I would be interested to have your answer on this quick Slido. So you can go to the QR code, and hopefully you should be able to, I can maybe share the link in Zoom as well. Let me see here. No, that's not the one. Sorry. Here, this is the one. So you should be able to answer. Okay, so have you used a conversational AI system before LLMs? That was really my question. And no problem at all if your answer is no. Really, really. I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if a large majority of people are saying no here, which seems to be the case. Okay, some have used things like ELIZA. Very few have used the dialogue system. That's totally normal or expected as well, because most of these systems were really not available to a large audience. Okay, great. So you can still continuing answering. I'll have still one other question later, but it is good. Great, thanks a lot. So what do we know from the research about these pre-LLM systems? One way to make sense of this, and it's connected to what I said about the different types of system, is first, let's try to have a typology of systems. And this was pretty difficult because of these systems were really going in many different directions. So one way to try to make sense of these different systems and different affordances also of the systems was to distinguish a direction of adaptivity that you see here between one-way and two-way systems. So systems that would really, where there would be a really going back and forth between the user and the system where they fully adapt, or rather something where one of the two is just always answering to the other, which is what we see in reactive system, where the system always answers, but really has very limited initiative, and in form-focused systems where it's more the user who has to kind of fill the small tasks that are sent by the system. The system guides the interaction. And so really this one direction of adaptivity, and the other one was the level of user control. Is it more system initiative or is it more user initiative? This was a typology that we proposed with Thomas François and Pete Smet in 2022 that worked relatively well, even if it was still frustrating for some reasons, but it really was 22 before November 22 and before LLMs. So the question is, does it still work for LLMs? And that's something I'm going to try to tackle today. The most important thing about dialogue-based goal is to not forget what's the rationale, what's the reason we're thinking about this, why are we thinking about this? And the main reason in most of the papers that you will see is there is a very clear recognition that we need, learners of a foreign language need meaning-focused output and interaction opportunities, right? This is not new. This is since Swain and Long and the four strands of pollination, and everywhere you see meaning-focused output, meaning-focused interaction as something that seems to be a key in developing at least a productive ability in a language, right? And so these systems would allow to have these opportunities, especially in contexts, in learning contexts, in instructed SLA contexts, where these opportunities are not enough in the classroom typically, which I think is the case in most foreign language learning contexts, right? Most foreign language contexts, you don't have a lot of opportunities for output. Typically, I don't know in other languages, but I know that in French, many teachers of French, even when they know that output is important, it arrives at the end of the unit, and they always say, oh, well, we have too much to cover. Let's skip the last activity, which is a productive activity, which was the most important to really develop this ability. And so the ability to do output is rarely developed. And so that's where really these systems can offer an opportunity in all these contexts where learners have no other opportunities beyond the classroom to practice meaningfully, right? Now, added to that is the fact that some systems allow for written practice, but some also for spoken practice, and always meaningful practice, hopefully. In theory, these systems could be fully controllable. You could fully adjust and adapt to the level of the students. Now, it's in theory, because most of the systems I've seen are not actually adapting very much to the level of the learner. And what is definitely, this is more well established and more demonstrated, is that these are also environments where students who have still a lot of anxiety toward productive abilities and productive practice can actually have lower stakes, probably because there's no human in front of them judging them. And so probably it's a low anxiety environment, which allows more practice, where more willingness to communicate and things like that. And actually, there have been a lot of interesting results on this side. I'm just mentioning them here because I'm not going to cover that later. But for example, in a study in 2024, 3 researchers led by Zhang really demonstrated very strong effects on not only that it was a low anxiety environment, but even that it was lowering the anxiety, the foreign language anxiety, and increasing the willingness to communicate of the learners more than interactions with peers or interaction with native speakers. So this seems to be relatively established now. I mean, established is a big word, but we have we have evidence to say that, yes, in terms of anxiety, chatbots are positive. They seem to really have an interesting effect there. Now, in 2022, we published this first meta-analysis about the field. It was still a very preliminary also meta-analysis in the sense that it was still a field that is in its infancy. Maybe it was even too early for meta-analysis, I'm not sure. But it gave us quite interesting results. And the first results is, well, this is usual, but the effect size is a medium effect size, slightly lower than what you could expect from interactions with humans, with peers, and with native speakers, which is what we expect, because the goal here is not to say that chatbots are better than humans. Interaction with human is always going to be better, except maybe for anxiety, but we use it here mostly to cover the lack of opportunities for interactions with other humans, right? So medium effect size, okay. More interesting is what caused differential effects. And one very interesting thing, I think, is, or at least it confirms an intuition, is learners, beginner learners benefit more from these kind of interactions than more advanced learners, especially A1, A2 learners, lower, intermediate, and really beginner learners really seem to benefit more. That's what you see here on the graph. A1, the effect size, the mean effect size is much higher, and then it starts decreasing. And also we have a large confidence interval at B2, advanced learners, mostly because we don't have many studies. And it makes sense, of course, at B2 level, you can really have a lot of interactions in more realistic and more realistic context where you don't really need this kind of control from the system. So that makes, of course, sense, right? Second, an interesting meta-analysis, a recent meta-analysis from this year, by Hu and Min, also showed that actually it seems that the effect is stronger for out-of-school practice. Now, it is not absurd. I mean, we could expect that. Definitely using it as a kind of classroom, as a kind of homework opportunity makes sense, and it seems to have a strong effect there. The effect is also mediated by the age and the educational level. That is a little bit more complex, so I'm going to skip over this. And definitely a lot of effect is mediated by corrective feedback. What we see is systems, and that's what you see on the right here, systems that offer corrective feedback, whether explicit or implicit, have clearly stronger effect than systems that don't. Again, completely coherent with what we know about SLA, but it's interesting to see it here as well, right? Now, what is really a key is that this is not so much about systems, it's really about implementation. It's not so much about the technology, it's much more about instructional design, it's about deciding to provide feedback, it's about providing relevant tasks and things like that. Okay. Now, let's go to this new era, the LLM era, and let's see what has changed and what remains, okay? The first step, maybe the first thing to say about research on conversational AI in this LLM era is that there has been a large change in terms of access. And to demonstrate that, I want to see if you could answer the next question on Slido. So it's still the same link, but could you answer, and here we have now in the previous one, I'm just going to go back to the previous one, just 1 second. Yeah, 35 responses, 54 said no, right? And let's see now who has used an LLM to practice a conversation in a foreign language or in the target language, or who has used it with their students to do that, who has had their learners to do this. Okay, this is also something I definitely would expect. Great. I should have maybe asked separate questions for those who did it with their learners, their students, and those who did it themselves. That's also interesting to distinguish. But here, really, I decided to merge the two. But yeah, you clearly see that the majority of people have used Gen AI, but I also expect that maybe not directly to practice conversation, maybe more in the paradigm I mentioned as LLM as an assistant for brainstorming, for revisions, post editing, or to provide ideas, suggestions, things like that. So that makes totally sense. And then some have used it out of curiosity, and some have used it for conversational practice in writing, and a few orally, which is also expected because it's still more difficult to use that systematically. Okay, and very few have never used it. Okay, great. Thank you so much for answering this. So what you can see, and I suppose your experience confirms this, is that access to chatbot has changed. That's probably the major change of this new era. Before ChatGPT, you could really have a lot of trouble finding any place to practice with a chatbot, because those chatbots were either extremely limited, or their access was limited, or they were things like, so that's what I'm mentioning here. There were, for example, some commercial products like the EATS system, but mostly offered to institutions. So if your university or school had no access to it, you could not have an access to that. So definitely very limited access before, and now suddenly since 2022, everyone has an immediate free access to off-the-shelf chatbots, right? Not to chatbots designed for language learning, but off-the-shelf generic chatbots like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, Mistral, DeepSeek, etc. So clearly, the access has changed. It has also changed for developers. So it's not just that the normal user can use ChatGPT. It's also that a developer can very easily use the technology behind ChatGPT to implement a new system. And that has allowed more and more dedicated applications for language learning that are offering this kind of conversational interactions. Maybe you've heard of things like Duolingo Max, TOEFL, Mondly, 𝑐𝑒𝑡𝑙, Learner Practicum, things like that. Okay, then also, not only that it has changed access for developers, that they have access to the technology, but it's also incredibly much simpler and faster for them to create interactions, to create tasks. And we're talking really hours versus years. Before the availability of LLMs, really developing a system and developing the tasks around the technology would take months at least. And now you can really do that in a few minutes. This is not yet. It was yet, but yet there are two issues. There are still some issues, right? First of all, as we saw also in the poll, conversational use is not the most obvious use of LLMs. It's definitely not as prevalent as the use of LLMs as an assistant for writing. Which might be because, for example, maybe it's not engaging enough, which could be definitely the case. Maybe it's not interesting to have long conversations with LLMs, or if you actually do, maybe there are other issues with that. I'm not going to enter into that topic, but definitely there are limitations, ethical problems with engaging in long-term conversations with LLMs. And then does it have a different effect pedagogically than what we had before? How effective it is, right? So I'm going to try to answer this. Second thing that has changed, apart from access, studies, research. There has been really an explosion of studies since 2024, at least, giving us the time to publish the studies done over the system that were available at the end of 2022. So here is a quick graph of the number of studies we found that were meta-analyzable. So that means mostly experimental studies. So that's a short number of, a very limited number of studies among the whole field. But yet you can see here a huge explosion. Before we had per year maximum 5, 6 studies, 7 studies maybe per year on that could qualify, and suddenly, and that was only since 2020. Before it was like 1 per year, and then suddenly in 24 there's 25 studies. So it's time 5. And it's really, yeah, here the line, the red line is ChatGPT in November 2022. So there has been an explosion of possibilities in terms of research. And I really believe that chatbots, I'm still undecided whether it's a perfect system for learning, but I'm certain that it's a perfect system for research because it really allows us to study phenomena in a systematic way about things like output and interaction that were very difficult to systematize otherwise, right? Last thing, does it change something for our typology? So I believe that our typology before is not fully satisfactory to describe um, the new amount of systems, the new possibilities and the new affordances. So here is a proposal, and it's really an open-ended proposal, open to feedback from you, of a typology of conversational AI that we developed together with 𝘊𝘰𝘯𝘷𝘪𝘥𝘦, I mentioned before. So first of all, so it's a typology on 2 axes. And the first axis is really the level of learner output. And I'm following here early ideas from Norris and Ortega in their first meta-analysis in our field about the constraints on the learner response, for example, in a test, in outcomes, outcome measurements. But here I'm using it for what the learner is able to do inside the system. Is it completely free? He's able to, at the turn level, be able to really like write whatever they want, or is it a constrained system where he's mostly responding at a word level, just adding some words, but not really full sentences, not fully returns? And then less or more constrained even would be a system where the learner only has to repeat or say out loud an option. And then the most constrained system, which actually happens, and I'm going to mention this in a moment, is where the learner only selects, only points and click on an answer. So here are some examples of these. Actually, when you see most of the studies on robots, and I'm talking about physical robots for language learning, most of them are actually interactions where the learner only has to click, where you really can there's really a good reason to discuss whether this qualifies as conversational AI. I wouldn't say actually it's a dialogue or it's a conversation. It's really much more the robot says something and then you react by clicking somewhere on the screen, which is probably something we should disqualify. And so here the first idea is to say, okay, actually conversational AI starts above that level when we are at least repeating, and that's what you see in 𝘊𝘷𝘪𝘥𝘦, for example. Here is an option, a screenshot from 𝘊𝘷𝘪𝘥𝘦, where the learner it's a conversation here in Italian, but you have multiple options, but then to select the option, you have to say it out loud. So it's mostly oral practice, but you don't really have to fully construct new sentences, right? So this would be repeated level. And I don't have any specific examples of constraint level, but maybe that will pop up in the future and emerge. And then free output, that would be most of what we see, for example, in immerse here, or what you see in interactions with any kind of LLM like Claude and ChatGPT. That's the first axis, right? Then a second axis would be, I think, the most interesting would be to have an axis at least at the level of focus on form. And why? Because this allows us to say, okay, again, some systems are really focused on form, and so because of that, they might be too focused on form to qualify as a conversation, but most of our conversations should be focused on meaning. So this, of course, the focus on form, focus on meaning axis is not new. It kind of follows also the communicative continuum from the 1980s that was already discussed at that time. What we could see is something like this. So immerse would be a fully focused on meaning interaction, ChatGPT as well, as the interaction I showed at the beginning with Claude would also be here at fully focused conversational AI and dialogue-based school. And that's where we really said, okay, for example, the point and click studies that would really not qualify. Okay, so let me talk very quickly about this meta-analysis. These are really preliminary results, so I won't get into many details here. As I said, the lead researcher on this meta-analysis is 𝘊𝘰𝘯𝘷𝘪𝘥𝘦. Our inclusion criteria, we started in 2010, and we've still been collecting studies this year. We include all studies involving any kind of conversational AI or dialogue-based call, including talking robots, which were mostly absent from early and previous meta-analyses in my understanding. But only if they are above or at least at the repeated response level. So we exclude point and click. Or one of our focus, of course, is to see, okay, do LLMs make a difference, right? Versus pre-LLMs or non-LLM systems. We focus on outcomes in terms of L2 development. That means holistic speaking or possibly writing, but we've seen mostly speaking development, or more specific things like fluency development, vocabulary development. That's possible as well. And here, I'm not going to present the full results on the whole set of studies because we actually found a lot of studies, but I'm going to talk about the results on a subset focusing mostly on speaking development. So the screening and inclusion, I'm going to skip over the details, but we follow the PRISMA guidelines. Initially, we found more than 3,000 publications, of which we retained 210, of which 84 have enough data to be meta-analyzable. But that is a lot, right? This is much more than many meta-analyses that I've seen, and definitely many more studies than what I was able to include in 2022. I mean, the inclusion stopped earlier than 22, but it was 2020, and we were limited to around 20. And so it's really a much larger sample of studies. Here I'm presenting the results about 28 studies, which include almost 2,000 learners. It's a multi-level meta-analysis, but I'm not going to enter into technical details here. Here is the first forest plot. Now, what is interesting to see is, first of all, the general effect size, the overall effect size. The overall effect size is 0.74, which is quite interesting because it's a large effect, and it's definitely much larger than pre-LLM meta-analysis. So earlier we had effects between 0.5 and 0.6, and here it seems like we are increasingly having larger effects. Now, we can discuss that in a minute, but my hypothesis is that it's not necessarily only because technology allows it, but also, and maybe not so much because of technology, but maybe also because by allowing more access to this technology, we've been able to have much better studies, which much more relevant outcomes, and hence more interesting results. The effect is very different depending on the experimental design. It's much stronger for pre-test, post-test, and of course the control studies have very different effects. We also are going to focus a lot on comparing different control conditions, because here I'm aggregating everything, and that's not the point we want to make. But in these early preliminary results, we've not been able yet to find enough studies of a certain type of control to really be able to draw results there. But definitely there's something to be done in terms of control conditions. Now, I think that one of the most interesting things to do here is to compare systems, not because technology is the main explanation, but yet it explains some things. So the first comparison with, is there a difference between LLM and pre-LLM systems? The short answer is there is no significant difference, but that is to be expected. Firstly, because it's a subset, a limited subset. Second, because, well, you would need a very strong effect to see an effect of just the type of technology. So it's definitely expected, but when you see the mean effect, the LLMs have 0.8 or almost 0.9, and the pre-LLM 0.7. So even though this is not a significant difference, and we cannot draw any conclusions from this, there clearly is something that was not as clear in previous studies when we compared systems. I never saw that kind of difference in my previous typologies. And when you look at certain systems in particular, it's quite interesting to see the mean effect. Again, this is not a significant difference between systems that we can completely demonstrate, mostly because we don't have enough studies for each system, but maybe we can isolate some of these systems. Now, things like Replica, not a very strong effect. Alexa, quite large effect, not so bad. Google Assistant, very similar, which makes sense, right? It's the same type of interactions, kind of question answering. And the chatbot that has been used in interesting studies, so an interesting effect. Monly has a quite interesting effect. And ChatGPT has the strongest effect among all the systems. Now, and this is a more reliable effect, mostly because there have been now quite a lot of studies about ChatGPT. And we could still distinguish ChatGPT 3.5 from GPT-4 and GPT-5, etc. So we can only expect these effects to be more robust with time and stronger with time, I think. Now, when we compare tasks, now this is always tricky because categorizing tasks in that kind of conversations is tricky always, because also the papers do not explain every time in a lot of details the type of task that is being conducted. So we didn't see any significant difference. And here you see between opinion exchange, role play, and small talk, not very clear differences. Only that we see a bit more effect in small talk, but again, not significantly different from the rest. Dependent variable, not a huge difference, except that it's interesting to see that fluency seems to be promising, which again is consistent with our expectations and also the rationale for using this. But there are still too few studies that are really exploring specific dimensions of things like fluency and other dimensions of speaking development or L2 development in general. Most of the studies are really about holistic development. Okay, let me conclude here. First of all, by saying there's still much to learn, both from early chatbots and also definitely a lot of questions with these new systems. But I think that mostly the LLMs really have opened up a lot of new possibilities for research because we now have access, and so it's really a moment where we should go beyond simply testing whether the technology is useful, but really using the technology to test hypotheses that we have about the way people learn, or about the better instructional approaches to these types of conversations, for example. Also, I think there are still too many studies where I'm not sure how to say this, but it's an opportunistic approach to outcome variables. Like where the studies really choose the outcome variable not because they are consistent with the rationale behind, but really because it was easy to access or easy to measure. And so there sometimes is a mismatch between the rationale for using conversational AI and the outcome variables that are selected in some of the studies. But it's getting much better with the recent study. So this is really something that I hope will be improved upon with time. And finally, as I've said before, I really think that it's all about the implementation and not so much about the technology. I really think that the technology is giving us access to this. But what is going to explain the difference in effects, I think it's not the model or Claude versus ChatGPT versus DeepSeek, but really the technical implementation in terms of system instructions. For example, do we explicitly say to the model to give feedback or not? The instructional design, and this is even more important, do we explicitly recommend giving feedback, scaffolding? What is the task? How do we put this task in a way that is fitting inside an instructed context and that matches the activities in the classroom? Do we adapt to the level of the learners, etc.? And the instructional setting is also going to explain differences, right? Who are the learners? What is the proficiency level? What is the context? How much time on task they have? I really think this is going to explain the results much more than technology itself. And finally, as I hope I've been able to show, I really think that LLMs are a testing ground for SLA and language pedagogy research. And I hope we will see more of that kind of research in the future. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really interested toward your feedback and your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bibauw. This was an amazing presentation. I think we all learned about where we're coming from, where we are, where we're going potentially. So I would like to invite the questions for Dr. Bibauw. We'll start with the room, and then we'll move on to the questions in the Zoom chat box. There you go, Karen.
Well, yeah, thank you for the presentation. This is really interesting. I was kind of listening for how you, when you're talking about conversation, and this is something I've struggled with for some time, when you're talking about conversation and doing, the definitions and the framework and looking at the history and into now, I didn't hear you talk about written versus oral language. And that's something that, I mean, that's a pretty big change, from my, at least from my history, which is, kind of long. And I just wondered if that has figured into any of your thinking or maybe your plans for future research.
Thank you so much. Great question. And yes, indeed, it's something that I've not been able to tackle here. I think that in terms of meta-analysis, for example, most of the studies are still working on written interaction, even though oral interaction is now really available. But it's changing. It's definitely changing. When you see some studies done on Alexa, for example, it's definitely much more oral. And I think that most of our experiences with ChatGPT and LLMs are still written, dominantly written. But hopefully, it really opens possibilities that weren't there before. Now, I've not seen yet any results. We haven't coded yet the modality of the results in this meta-analysis, so I don't have insights about the current state of results. In my previous meta-analysis, the difference was not so strong, but definitely there was a kind of transfer versus, there was an effect of, depending on the outcome was measured orally. If the intervention was in the same modality, then the outcome would be stronger, of course, the results would be stronger. So if you practice orally, of course, your oral outcomes will be better. While if you practice in writing and then test orally, it's of course, you see less of an effect, which is, again, very much expected, but interesting to confirm. And yet there was a transfer effect. So even though as we've seen, I think in STMC research in the early 2000s already, that there is a transfer from written practice toward oral competency and proficiency. So I think it shows here as well, but yet a bit more limited than if you practice in the same mode. Yeah. That's what I can say at this stage.
Thank you.
Anyone else from the room? Mustafa?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think my question is also somehow related to Dr. Schapol's question. So as far as I know, and I'm not an LLM expert, LLMs are mostly trained on written data rather than spoken data. But do you think that has a role on, that's why we have so many studies focusing on writing? And are you aware of any tools that, or any AI tools that is being trained on spoken data?
This is really interesting, yes. So in terms of research, I think it's mostly a question of feasibility, including feasibility and time of measuring the effects and measuring the outcome. So it's always extremely time intensive to test individually students in terms of speaking abilities. Unless you have a way to automatically measure that, but most of the time it's really very time intensive, and that explains why we have mostly studies on writing. Now, in terms of LLM and technologies and models, it's true that definitely writing is a very dominant. The written part of the training set is dominant, yet there are a lot of written data, transcriptions of spoken data that are also used, I think, like subtitles, for example, subtitles from movies. That's very, very large data sets, and that's certainly used for training as well. Second, nowadays, since already more than a year, I think all these models are trained as multimodal models. And that means that there is no longer a very strong separation between, you train an oral model based on oral data, you train a written model, but you really train it together. And it's multimodal and multilingual as well, right? It's the same thing for languages. It's what allows ChatGPT and LLMs to have much better performances with low languages that have low presence on the web, for example. It's much better than when we had parallel approaches to multilingualism. Here we have really an approach where everything is mixed and it learns together, and actually that gives us much better results, at least in terms of efficiency. That's why it's much more convincing than previous versions where you would have really a kind of transcription from one mode to the other.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have 𝘊𝘰𝘯𝘷𝘪𝘥𝘦 on Zoom who would like to ask a question herself. You can unmute yourself, 𝘊𝘰𝘯𝘷. Or I can read the question for you.
Oh, great.
Okay, there you go. You're unmuted. Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, I cannot open my camera since it's almost midnight in Indonesia. I'm currently carrying out research on the use of ChatGPT in speaking. And what I am actually expecting from Dr. Bibauw is that if you ever encounter results on the use of AI in speaking self-efficacy, especially with the result that their self-efficacy didn't improve. Because I came across actually one study that yes, the speaking self-efficacy is improving, but in my research, it didn't. Like, I asked my participants to copy and paste a prompt that I gave them, that I asked ChatGPT to be a conversation companion and also to give feedback on certain aspects like grammar topics and things like that. And I gave, on that prompt, I gave a specific topic. Then I asked ChatGPT to be a conversation companion and also give feedback. When I, when I measure their speaking self-efficacy, it didn't improve. My hypothesis was that perhaps because ChatGPT give, I don't know, perhaps too many feedbacks or something like that, that made the participants didn't have inactive mastery experience of the 𝘊𝘷𝘪𝘥𝘦 self-efficacy.
It's a good question.
So,
the first thing I would say is the fact that you didn't find an effect is not proof that there is no effect, right? There are many reasons why the effect might not show up in your results, including, for example, depending on the test or the duration of the intervention, or yes, maybe simply the test. I would start by looking at the test, whether the test is supposed to show an effect, and also the intervention, is it large enough, long enough, for example.
Okay, yeah, perhaps, yeah.
But it's super interesting. I'm really interested to know more.
All right. Thank you, 𝘊𝘰𝘯𝘷. We'll have one more question. I would like to give a chance to Jane to ask her question.
Okay.
Thank you so much for yours. Jane, you can either unmute yourself or I can read the question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So that was a very, I think, insightful presentation. Actually, recently I'm doing a pedagogical innovation, and I'm trying to design a chatbot to help students to do a continuous writing task. So we have a text. I ask a student to read, and the students need to continue the story. But I designed the chatbot and ask a student to use them as a character bot, so that help them to develop their ideas for the writing task. So I see that you divided actually the chatbot into two types, the before LM and after LM. But you also said that most studies are focusing on speaking instead of writing. As using chatbot as in interlocutors. So my question is, would cognitive load be a major concern so that such studies are limited? Or have you ever seen such studies that similar to what I'm trying to do? Thank you. That's my question.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's a lot of there are a lot of interesting ideas in what you mentioned. Cognitive load, I haven't seen it mentioned until now in studies, but definitely it's something. Now, most of the studies I've mentioned, the outcomes are speaking development, but the intervention is not always oral. It's sometimes also writing. Yeah. But I don't have an answer about the cognitive load theory.
Thank you.
I think we will have one last question by Yasmina Contreras Soto.
Yes, thank you so much. Impressive presentation, Dr. Bibauw.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Did you say that the strongest effect size was with ChatGPT, right?
At least,
yes.
Yeah, it's not a significant difference again, but it's where we found the strongest, yes.
And did you happen to encounter information in this meta-analysis comparing ChatGPT and Claude, which is the first one you showed at the beginning of your presentation? Right?
No, so I haven't seen anyone using Claude in those studies.
Yeah.
But when I say ChatGPT, I'm not assuming that it's ChatGPT that is intrinsically superior. It's just that it's much more known and used. And I would expect the same results for any similar LLM. So I would assume that Claude or Gemini or even DeepSeek would have extremely similar results. It's much more because ChatGPT has been used a lot and in sound studies. So we've seen interesting results, while the other systems are much more rare.
Yeah.
But it's really more about the LLM that allows a lot of studies to happen.
I'm asking because we are also conducting research. We've been conducting this research for more than a year about the use of Claude as a tutor for developing academic writing in a specific IELTS task. And when choosing the LLM at the beginning, we compared with my co-researchers the feedback given by Claude and the feedback given by ChatGPT. And it was quite interesting to discover that ChatGPT was far more generous when assessing students, and we had the rubrics. We also designed our own rubrics, and then what we did, and I was fascinated, is that we compared, feedback given by Claude and our feedback. And also we allocated students, according to the bands, IELTS bands, and it was incredibly, close, the feedback given by Claude and our feedback. So we are working on that now. And that's why I was asking you, because I was very interested about this presentation and how, I could
find...
I
think that there have been a lot of interesting presentations about assessment, using LLMs for assessment. And that I think they go in the same direction as you. They provide quite reliable assessment tools. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question from the room before we move on? Okay, Dr. Bibauw, thank you so much. This was an amazing
Thanks a lot.
presentation, and you can tell by the number of the questions you have. And I would like to tell everybody here in the room or on Zoom that we actually will have the recording of this presentation. So if you would like to see it again, watch it at your own time, please do so. And thank you very much again. Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Bibauw. Thank you.